All right, welcome back. It's been a while since I've had a chance to talk to you guys. It's winter break. Super excited to get to talk to you guys today. We're going to be looking at a few different things. I know it's been a while since I posted a video. Sorry about that. Just, got busy with stuff. So today we're going to kind of be talking about colonial encounters in Africa, Asia, and Oceania. We're mostly going to be talking about European expansion and its effect on cultures and societies in Africa, in Asia, and in Oceania, which is like Fiji, Hawaii, Tonga, those kind of places. We're also going to do a little segment at the end where I talk about, just fun kind of entertainment stuff. Today we're going to talk a little bit about Phoenix. I visited Phoenix over New Year's Eve, and I also had the pleasure of seeing the My Chemical Romance reunion show in Los Angeles on the 20th of December. So I'm going to show you guys some videos of that. I'm super excited to do that. I'm sporting a hat my mom got me for my birthday. I'm digging it. It's a fedora. My grandfather, growing up, wore a fedora every day, regardless of what he was doing. Just a super classy guy, ex-World War II vet, just one of the greatest guys I've ever known. So I've always wanted one, and she got one for me for my birthday this year, and so I figured I'd sport it for you guys today. So let's hop into it. Today, as I told you, we're going to be talking about kind of colonial mindset when it came to colonizing the people and its effect on the people. So the first thing that we're going to really talk about is three core concepts when it comes to the mentality of the European colonizers, excuse me. And the first one that we're going to talk about is this thing called scientific racism. Scientific racism is the idea that a particular human ethnicity is scientifically better off than another ethnicity within race within the human group. And so the way they kind of did this, an example of them doing that was they measured the craniums of African nationals or indigenous people, and then they measured the craniums of Europeans, and the craniums of the Europeans had a slightly larger cranium, resulting in them justifying themselves as the better of the human species. And so along with that came a better these civilizing missions. And the idea was, although still coming from a place of superiority, that they, being the dominant race, the Europeans, they needed to come in and civilize these lesser races within the human species. And so from that, you start to see more education, religion being spread through that. Kind of the backdrop to all of this, though, is social Darwinism. Social Darwinism is the concept that the most fit race will survive. And in fact, it's for the betterment of the human species if the most fit race continues to survive and better themselves. So let's jump into the topics. So the first topic we're really going to talk about, there's a few, but one of the first ones that we're going to talk about is this scramble for Africa. Remember, this is the second phase of the Industrial Revolution. Before I really get started, we're working out of Ways of the World. It's chapter 10 is what I'm kind of lecturing out of. It's a unit 4 in your... So we're going to talk about the scramble for Africa. We're going to talk about Asia, Oceania. We're going to talk about just what it was like being under the thumb of these colonial rulers. And the first place that we're really going to talk about is India. So the Indian people had a rebellion in 1857 and lasted until about 1858. The way that this started was that there were some containers or cartridges that were soaked in cows and pig's blood. Well, both of those are sacred animals in the different religions within India, whether it's Hindi or Buddhist. And so they took extreme outrage to this. This was a rebellion on all phases of society. So from your rich to your poor, we saw this movement against British colonial rule. And what kind of took place was it really forced the hand of the United Kingdom to rule over that area in a more strict manner. Before that, if we can remember back, They used India as kind of a puppet state where they would leave some of their military there but not rule it directly. They allowed the Indians to rule themselves directly. This also made them extraordinarily cautious in the way that they were ruling their colonies. Remember that just 60 years prior, they had lost the United States. And so they were very cognizant that during this second phase of the Industrial Revolution, that you have to have the raw goods in order to be a competitor on the global stage. The United Kingdom is not an area that is full of raw materials. And so as such, they had to really get after other raw goods. So just kind of talking about racial divide within the colonies, we can really just kind of look at Africa for this. And the more European influence that an area has, the more racially divided it ended up becoming. For example, in our best and most severe example of that, I mean, you can look at the United States as well, but we'll look at Africa, excuse me. So when we talk about South Africa, we're talking about the creation of this thing called a homeland. And so within that homeland, they would separate the people and segregate them by race, essentially. It meant separate homes, separate education, limitation on social status and how well they could climb. It also forced them into a cheap labor situation. So those that are in Africa are the natural African people, or the indigenous people of that area, were forced into the cheaper labor section when your Anglo or your white Europeans that were coming in were given the positions of more prominence simply because of their race or ethnicity. This idea eventually leads to apartheid in the 20th century. We'll get more into that in the next, probably in the next few chapters. But just keep in mind that the onset of that happened in the 19th century and with the Second Industrial Age. But to counter South Africa, another African state, Nigeria, which was one of the least colonized areas, saw much less racial divide as a result. And so you have these two different countries within Africa, and the level of racial divide was distinctively different simply because of the amount of colonial rule by the Europeans. So if we're talking about continuity and change, some of the changes that took place in Africa as a result of colonization, as I said, tax collection, sanitization, communication, transportation, colonial style economics, the idea that there is a global network of trade, that gold, diamonds, and some of these newly developed cash crops like cocoa, what we'll talk about later, or cacao, which is made for making chocolate, are made to used to make chocolate, there we go, was readily wanted and needed in the global stage. And so Africa was a hotbed for those things. And so it opened up those markets to Africa. We also saw some growth in African national status. As I said, the cacao plant in Ghana, so it's used to make chocolate. So during this time period, Ghana actually became the leading exporter of chocolate in the world. This gave those farmers much more flexibility than it ever did before. We saw an increase in economic status for a lot of nationals of Ghana. Okay, so if we're going to talk economies, since we're talking about Ghana, we'll talk a little bit about economy of the colonial period. We saw this mass migration, much like we saw in the United States post-Civil War, where we saw a mass migration from the South to cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, even as far as the West Coast in search of labor. Much the same took place in Africa. Some of that was contributed to like I said, the second phase of the Industrial Revolution and the need for labor in these cities. The more industrialized your city, the more labor you need in the cities, the more urbanized your country gets. And we saw a lot of that in Africa. However, some of that can be contributed to the loss of land as well, and the removal of the past, of the way that they used to run their societies with small farms, like owned by families within a tribe. And we started to see more of a movement towards going towards the city, working within the city, and earning your money that way. A good example of the loss of land would also be in South Africa. Again, one of the biggest countries within Africa to really see this segregation take place. And a great example of that is in 1913, they passed a law that gave 88% of all land within the country of South Africa to your European descendant citizens or your white citizens. The remaining 12% was then given to the indigenous people or the African people of that country. Also during this time period, women earned roughly 50 to 75% less than males. So we're still looking at a continuance of the patriarchal society, something that we still kind of battle today. Although we have shrunk that gap, it's still there. And so it's still something that we need to get better at. And it's kind of indicative of what history is. We get the question a lot as history teachers, as historians, is why do we study history? These guys are all dead. And it's to break the chain of corruption and the chain of things that have happened, to be aware of what took place in the past, how we got to where we are, and how we can get better in the future. Remember, if you're taking my course, I consider you a social scientist. I expect you to analyze all aspects of the past, relate it to now, and how can we better the future. That is kind of a mission of our class. And so if you're viewing this just for fun, I challenge you to do the same. Look at your life. Look at the life that we're living. What happened in the past to get us there, and how can we get past that in the future? Another huge factor during this time period when you're talking about economies is the gold rush period took place, late 1800s. This took place in not just the United States and in California. It also took place in places like New Zealand, Australia, and Canada. And so what ended up happening was a huge migration of Chinese immigrants would flee to these cities, or these countries, looking for work, looking for the ability to mine gold. And all four countries, Australia, US, New Zealand, and Canada, they put bans on visas from people of Chinese origin coming to the United States. Those bans remained in place until, for the United States, well into the 20th century. Migration was met with low wages and extremely high housing costs in many of those countries. So these immigrants would come over looking to better their lot in life, and a lot of times that didn't take place because of the hurdles that were placed in front of them. And so we're going to talk women and the colonial economy. Pre-colonial African women, although still serving under a patriarchal society where the men ruled over them and told them, and kind of defined their roles in life, women did have a lot more economic freedom before the Europeans colonized Africa. And what I mean by that is that women were farmers, were able to cultivate crops, sell their crops, and had some say-so in the destiny of their lives. Fast forward to colonial rule, and what ended up happening was a more defined version of what women's life should be. They should be homemakers. Their workload did increase, as they did have to farm as well as be homemakers, but it was more of your domestic farming foods for your family to eat. The men would go off to work these, large-scale farms, these mines, these industrialized cities, and the women would be home, working the land for their family, providing for their children meals and their husbands, and that kind of idea. A good example of that is, again, Ghana. Remember, Ghana had a huge explosion in the cacao plant and the manufacturing of chocolate and stuff like that. And so the men would go work those trees, and the women were left at home to nurse the children, take care of the domestic aspect of their life. And along with that, they were also expected to farm their family plot. So you saw a doubling of the amount of work, as they used to work that family plot together, and maybe they would sell some of it as a family. Now it was up to the women to work that land themselves while the men went out and made money. All right, so that's the first section of this video. It was super fun talking to you guys about it. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Really excited to talk to you about the next aspect of it.